Okay, hello everybody. I'm Sara Ajel Yaqeen, a Syrian activist and sociologist residing currently in São Paulo, Brazil. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, Imperialism, Anti-Imperialism and the Syrian Revolution. Part of our series of webinars, The Syrian Revolution, A History from Below. I'd like to introduce our webinar series a bit to put you in context. And of course, you can also follow up with me by accessing our just launched
it's 15 hours.
Oh, sorry, my computer speaks. Our website is syrianrevolt.org. Syria has been the focus of much regional and global attention following the massive uprisings, the massive protests that erupted in mid-March 2011. Many have bemoaned the gradual development of those massive protests and this uprising to what they call a civil war, due to the intervention of multiple local, regional, and international actors. And due to this confusion, so-called confusion, the Syrian uprising and the protagonists of the Syrian uprising have been silenced, marginalized, ignored, or just simply ostracized. The hegemonic narratives created around these hegemonic narratives centered always around geopolitical rivalries and sectarian conflict have dominated much of Western and international discourse, ridding the Syrian popular classes of any social, political, or revolutionary agency. Our project in this webinar series, as organizers, is to propose a radically different approach. The Online Summer Institute, which you can also find through the website that we just introduced, titled The Syrian Revolution, A History from Below, is a webinar series about grassroots politics, class struggles, and state violence in Syria since the 1970s up till today. It's actually a 12-part series that started already. We already had one webinar, started on the 20th of June and will extend through the 5th of August. It will include presentations from activists, organizers, academics, and writers, and will cover topics as wide as grassroots movements, imperialism, anti-imperialism, feminist politics, the weaponization of healthcare, refugees, the Kurdish self-determination question, and of course, the future of the Syrian and regional uprisings back in 2011 and ongoing ones. Of course, the main purpose of the this webinar is to challenge the mainstream Orientalist and Manichaean perspective that have come to dominate narratives about the Syrian revolution ever since 2011. What all these narratives share, and I'll leave it to our speakers to elaborate more on that, is denying the role of the Syrian people as actors in their own popular struggles. We'd like to call this an attempt at a people's history of the Syrian revolution, providing an alternative analysis of the revolutionary process by emphasizing progressive and internationalist perspectives. I'd like to also give you just a few examples of what kind of webinars we'd have, just a few names, not necessarily in the order that they will come into fruition. Black Lives Matter to Palestine and Syria, the politics of revolutionary solidarity on the 8th of July. From Syria to Mexico, the fight for a world without borders on the 18th of July. Syria and the second wave of Middle Eastern and North African revolutions. Only a few examples of building platforms of solidarity, international organization, and translating and transfiguring praxis across borders. Okay, I would like to introduce our speakers right now, who are, of course, Lara Al-Khatib, Ashley Smith, and Yasin Al-Haj Saleh. I would like to start with Lara Al-Khatib, a Syrian gender studies researcher who works on the Me Too movement and the liberation of political prisoners in the Middle East and North African region. Lara is also a member of the Alliance of Middle East and North African Socialists, who, by the way, are also co-sponsoring this webinar. Welcome, Lara. Are you with us?
Thank you so much, Sada, for that introduction. Let me start by saying a big thank you to my fellow panelists, Ashley and Yassine. It's a pleasure to be among you today. And the people joining in online, hello. Hopefully
Hello.
This will be a fruitful discussion.
Okay.
So,
Lara, if I can ask,
I was thinking.
Oh, sorry.
Tell me.
If I can just ask you, like, just a question before we start. Like, looking at the very disturbing politics of international solidarity between the left in sort of metropoles and revolutionaries in the peripheries, that sort of re-emerged after the start of the Arab Springs. Nowhere was this more salient than the case of the moral and political failure of the international left, the so-called anti-imperialist camp in Syria, who have either bluntly supported Assad for his so-called anti-imperialism, his secularism, or withheld their solidarity from the Syrian struggle for emancipation from the from a regime of mass murder. If you can please give us if you can present the arguments and logics that they draw on. My dog is going crazy. What do they circumvent, and what do they have in common? Please go ahead.
Surely. Thank you again, Sada, and hello, everyone. Right, so while I was thinking about this talk or this webinar series in general, I was thinking about three main things. The first is to decenter the Syrian narrative from geopolitics, which will hopefully get us to the second, which is to decolonize democracy from Western-centric analysis, and finally, to redirect attention towards class and social struggle and what it means to truly stand for people's right to self-determinate. So one of the most mainstream talking points about Syria, basically that the events that transpired in 2011, it's that it's a CIA-backed coup, that the US armed religious fundamentalists in an attempt to overthrow the Assad regime because the Assad regime is an anti-imperialist. Moreover, that this is part of a larger plan to destabilize the MENA region. Their logic follows that it started with Iraq and then moved to Syria, and finally it was Iran. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's start slowly. First, let me say that by centering the discussion around geopolitics, that enables state-centric discourse, which allows the campus left to argue for in defense of the state, the sovereignty of the state, as opposed to the sovereignty of the people. By being devoid of class analysis, such arguments are argued from a political position as opposed to being situated within socioeconomic realities, within local, yes, exactly. It erases individual agency and proposes this chess game viewpoint of the world where only leaders of the state are at the table. And this narrative, individual persons cannot take an active role in bringing about change or solutions. This narrow framework of what imperialism and consequently anti-imperialism is can be seen as constructed from within the capitalist system and as such reproduces its injustices, such as normalizing state violence and denying natives their voice and agency. And I think this is what bothers me the most about this stand, is just how bigoted and prejudiced it is as it seeks to continue this Orientalist imagery of who Arabs are and what they're capable of. Any independent action taken by the oppressed or working masses is rejected and then postulated in either simplistic binaries, or they take it to the other extreme where it becomes so convoluted, mixed with the mysticization and tribalization of the Orient that tracing the truth of the events is rendered impossible. And so our revolts are placed in a vacuum, decontextualized from the rest of the world, where resistance to global capitalism is expressed through protests and uprisings. But if you asked me about 2011, and I've lived most of my life in Syria, I can say that the protests were bound to happen. When Muhammad Abu Azizi set himself on fire, it forced us to confront our reality, to recognize our deep-seated fears in going against the current order, and seek out an alternative. Some on the anti-war left like to suggest that Syrians chose Assad and that defending the right for Syrians to determinate is defending the right to choose Assad. Well, actually, given the history, I mean, Assad overtook Syria in a military coup in 1970. Under his governance, he implemented a system in which power would be consolidated into smaller and smaller bodies. This was established through having a patronage network where the ruling family and its affiliates were able to hoard copious amounts of wealth and land. The regime further amassed its control by instilling mass surveillance. We were being monitored all the time, and we knew it. But perhaps where the regime really made a staple out of its name, it's through its brutal crackdown at any sign of dissent, effectively making it a dictatorship. When Hafez died, almost the very next day, the constitution was rewritten to allow Bashar to run in a referendum. I actually remember that referendum. I must have been 9 or 10 at the time, but mostly because there was an email circulated among my friends at school. You'd get a text asking you if you wanted to vote yes or no. And every time you click to press no, the window would shift left and right. I know it might sound trivial, but I think the reason why I remember this is because at a young age, it gave me a clear idea of what it was I was living. And so it should come as no surprise that that referendum ended with Bashar winning 97.3% of the votes. Does 97.3% of the votes sound like a reasonable number practiced in democracy? Or perhaps it reveals a totalitarian form of government. And this is a point I'd like to make clear, that the Assad regime is not only authoritarian, it is totalitarian in that it demands control over all aspects of human life. It demands the fragmentation of social relation, the subjugation of the spirit, and dominance over our freedom of expression. Be a loyalist or perish, surrender or starve, Assad or we burn the country. And it's quite eerie to see such binaries reinforced in Western discourse. It paints this image of Syria as Arabia land, and if it wasn't for the Assad rule, then Islamist terrorists would take over. And that's probably why fascists like the KKK's David Duke and the Italian Liberation Front and the AfD all throw their support behind him. And shouldn't this be an area of concern, that when it comes to keeping Assad in power, the far right and the fragments of the left are both in favor? The war on terrorism discourse, which surfaced post 9/11, justified the murder of thousands of innocent people and children under the claim of fighting terrorism. There's an excellent article by Siam Reiloun, and I can link it below, who explains that US, Russia, Turkey, which targeted Kurdish areas, and Syria are all guilty of such crime. Israeli forces actually use this narrative to annul the death of Palestinians under the claim of fighting Hamas terrorists. This makes it inconsistent to support the Palestinian struggle and not support Syrians on their request to self-determination. This narrative is not only deeply Islamophobic, it's simply not true. There are records of the Assad regime deliberately targeting hospitals and civilians. And in fact, it was people of Idlib and women in particular who played an active role in challenging religious fundamentalism. But there's this kind of belittling of our movement by the anti-war left and Western discourse. They mocked the idea that anarchist movements might have flourished in Syria, how unlikely it would be that the global south would have squats and vegan food and queer communities. But it doesn't work that way. You can't come to our resistance looking for your version of democracy and then say it doesn't exist when you don't find it. Because what we had in Syria was nothing short. In areas that were liberated from the regime, communities came together to form local councils. I think by the end of the 2013, there were 400 local councils made. Contrary to state control, this was a bottom-up form of organization. I think the anti-imperialist stand to me can be divided into three groups. So you have the Orientalist, Western-centrics, who can only see the struggle from US imperialism. You know, perhaps for these people, it's difficult to perceive as people from the Middle East as capable of forming their own democracies with their own ideas of how autonomous communities can come to exist. There's a dissonance that doesn't allow them to see their struggles reflected in people who come from totally different backgrounds. And so they suggest that in keeping with the peace will be brought by the same players who are killing us. And then you have the bad faith actors with a vested interest in propagating these lies, mostly due to their ties with the Russian state. And you can see them quite often on RT, on Sputnik, 21st Century, all of these. To these people, anybody who criticizes the regime as Al-Qaeda, it goes like this. But, you know, the good thing about information exchange happening online is that it leaves a digital footprint. And what softwares were able to find is that those conspiracy theories that link the white helmets to Al-Qaeda, that said that the chemical attacks are fake, were all propagated from Russian networks. And this gets me to the third group, who are people on the receiving end of this disinformation campaign. And honestly, I don't blame them. I mean, the fact that people believe, that the overwhelming majority believes in this and that they believe in it so strongly just shows that the disinformation campaign has done its job. Not only did it distract from the events happening on the ground, but it took time and energy from us as organizers to dispel them and fact-checking them. I call it gaslighting of a population. But this is an area of concern for me, actually, that when it comes to future social movements, you know, everything is happening so fast and people are growing into more precarious states and they definitely don't trust mainstream news anymore. So this makes them vulnerable to these attempts. A way to combat this is to familiarize yourself in how conspiracy theories work and detecting pro-Kremlin propaganda. You know, I can go through a whole list of how the Assad regime is not really anti-imperialist, or how the US didn't really want regime change in Syria, or the fact that the oversaturation of Russian military bases constitutes as imperialism. But for me, this disregards the bigger picture. It doesn't really matter if the Assad regime is anti-imperialist when his regime constitutes on the mass extermination of people and an unprecedented level of economic disparity where over 80% of the Syrian population today are under the poverty line. Fanon says that the liberation of the oppressed is not achieved through national or formal independence from colonialist and imperialist forces. It is by dismantling the patterns of dominance and hierarchy within the bourgeoisie society. Mind you, we have a critique of our oppression and we also have a critique of our resistance. There's a great article by Joseph Daguerre on Spectre. I'm also trying to link it in the comments below. Finally, I'm just going to say this, you know, dictatorships have a shelf life. Oppressive systems, corrupt systems, they try to prolong their rule for as long as possible, but their fall is in the happening. Especially now, considering this new generation who are growing up using this language of the revolution, whether it was my friends in Syria or Lebanon or comrades in Iraq who reject this lesser of evilism. We've developed this perspective that revolution is not only possible or probable, it is inevitable. Whether failed or still ongoing, as people are still protesting in Daraa and Sweden today, the bravery that it took from the Syrian people to rise up against their dictator is not something pundits can take away from them. In the end, the history of Syria will be written by its people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lara, for your intervention. I'd like to go on to Ashley Smith. Ashley is the managing director of Spectre, the journal that Lara just mentioned, actually, and is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America in Burlington, Vermont. He has written in numerous publications, including Truth Out, Jacobin, New Politics, Harper's, and many others, both online and print publications. He is currently working on publishing a book with Harper Books called entitled Socialism and Anti-Imperialism. I'd like to ask you, Ashley, welcome first, and I would like to ask you, I'd like to talk actually about this reluctance of much of the worldwide left to support the Syrian revolution. It seems to derive to a great extent from a certain very caricatural notion of what anti-imperialism is, which is campism.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that any kind of regime that stands in opposition to the hegemony of the US is worthy of support. And actually, this is most certainly something that is not new or restricted to the Syrian case. It's not the first time that the left has stood on the wrong side of history. One needs only to remember Czechoslovakia, Prague in 1968, the Hungarian Revolution in 56, Tiananmen Square in 89, Hong Kong back in 67, and today. And today, of course, which is very important to mention. Hong Kong recent protests started in June 2019 and continuing up to today. Can you please give us, can you please contextualize this justifying mass murder for the purpose of X of Y on part of the left? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and thank you, Sarah and Yassine, for participating in this webinar. I'm learning a lot from the whole series that we've helped organize. I'll try and come to grips with what Lara just asked me to explain this strange malady on much of the left, that is campism. Because really, if you think about it, the Syrian revolution should have been a simple test and easily passed for the international left. The whole left should have stood with the uprising, but it didn't. Whole sections of the left, in the name of anti-imperialism, opposed it from the very beginning. They dismissed it as a so-called color revolution orchestrated by the US as a part of a supposed plan of regional regime change. In doing so, they corrupted the genuine tradition of anti-imperialism and international solidarity. Now, the two primary roots of this catastrophic betrayal I'll try and lay out in what I have to say today. First is the Stalinist left's abandonment of internationalism during the Cold War, when they supported the USSR as a so-called socialist camp, which included China and their allied third world dictatorships. That led them to withhold solidarity with popular uprisings against those dictatorships, developing a deep methodology of siding with states as that opposed the US instead of the people in those states. They supported these states as a supposedly anti-imperialist camp, no matter how much they exploited their workers, oppressed nations, and oppressed national minorities. The second root of the campism is the contemporary left's complete misreading of imperialism today. They misperceive the US as all-powerful and manipulating states and popular movements to serve their interests. Given that, they reduce the left's task to simply opposing the US and defending regimes, however reactionary. This campism led much of the left to withhold solidarity from the Syrian revolution, slander it, side with the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad as an anti-imperialist, and even worse, support the intervention of Russian imperialism and Iran to save the regime. Before fleshing out the nature of this campism, it is important to reaffirm some basic facts about the Syrian revolution. It was a genuine mass popular revolt, just like all the others in the Arab Spring back in 2011. In its earliest phases, the rising united Syrians across divisions of sect and ethnicity in a common fight against the Assad dictatorship. Instead of supporting it, as they did almost all the identical movements in Tunisia and Egypt, the campus left fell into selective solidarity, supporting only those uprisings in states supported by the US, like Egypt, and opposing similar ones against regimes outside Washington's orbit, like Syria and Iran. As we know, the Syrian revolution foundered on its internal weaknesses and conflicts, making it unable to unite the movement throughout the country. That made it vulnerable to the forces of counter-revolution it confronted. First and foremost, the regime was the main agent of counter-revolution. It exploited the religious and ethnic divisions to split the country's people and working classes and bomb the popular uprising to smithereens. Second, Iran, Russia, and Iran's proxy Hezbollah provided a second arm of the counter-revolution. They intervened to save the regime from certain defeat, Russia supplying air power to bomb the resistance, and Iran and Hezbollah the ground forces to challenge the resistance on the ground. The third force of counter-revolution was the Islamic fundamentalist forces, who formed a counter-revolutionary force that opposed all the original aims of the uprising. The fourth pole of counter-revolution were the Gulf monarchies like Qatar, as well as Turkey and their devout bourgeoisies in the region, who backed the fundamentalists in as part of a proxy war with Iran. Finally, the US was another pole of counter-revolution. It never supported the revolution, nor pursued a policy of regime change. At first, it called for an orderly transition, hoping to replace Assad with some pliant dictatorship while preserving the core of the regime. But after the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the US abandoned that for a monomaniacal focus on destroying ISIS. These four or five forces of counter-revolution united to defeat the revolution. Now, the genuine left supported the revolution in its early progressive leadership, like we did the rest of the Arab Spring. We did so on the basis of genuine anti-imperialism and internationalism, principles rooted in the best of the socialist tradition, socialism from below. And we did so based on a few easy propositions. First, imperialism is the product of capitalism. Capitalism compels the capitalist states of the world to compete for the spoils of the global system for the benefit of their ruling classes. This produces an international hierarchy of states, imperialist powers, subordinate states, and oppressed nations. But this hierarchy is not static, but dynamic. Development, competition, and crises of various sorts upset the stable order of the world system, enabling lesser states to challenge established ones. This world system of imperialism produces three key conflicts. First, great powers against one another in a struggle for global supremacy. Second, great powers' oppression of subject nations, and those subject nations struggle for liberation. And third, workers and oppressed people struggle for emancipation within all capitalist nations in the imperial order. The best of the socialist tradition provided a methodology for approaching each of these conflicts with the goal of building an international movement of workers and oppressed peoples in the fight for international socialism. In conflicts between great powers, we side with neither, but organize international solidarity from below against both. If we are in one of the antagonistic countries, we oppose our own state first and foremost, because our main enemy is genuinely at home. But that does not mean we support the other great power, but instead support its working classes' struggle to overthrow their ruling class. In the conflicts between great powers and oppressed nations, we side with the national liberation struggle, but not uncritically and not by confusing national liberation with socialism. The goal is not just an independent capitalist nation state, but an international movement of solidarity among the working masses of our world. Finally, we always build solidarity with the movement of workers and oppressed peoples for their emancipation within all states. This methodology helped guide the genuine anti-imperialist left to extend solidarity with the Syrian revolution. We supported the progressive forces in the revolution, the emergent democratic leadership and the local coordinating committees and the regional councils that attempted to remake Syrian society in the areas they had liberated from the Assad dictatorship. We also extended solidarity to the Kurdish struggle for liberation, but not uncritically, because the main organization in Rojava, the PYD, did not support the revolution and was undemocratic in its rule in the liberated areas and was willing to coexist with Assad's regime, at least for a while. At the same time, we opposed all the counter-revolutionary interventions of the imperialist and regional powers, from Russia and Iran to the US, Turkey, and the Gulf monarchies. The campist methodology led them to betray the revolution and support the regime, as well as Russia and Iran. The campus had, in fact, long ago abandoned genuine anti-imperialism and internationalism. The key turning point in their shaping was during the Cold War. The communist parties throughout the world viewed the world system as divided between a capitalist camp and a socialist camp. And they considered that socialist camp anti-imperialist. And it was led, obviously, by the USSR and later both by the USSR and Mao's China. Of course, the USSR and its satellites had nothing to do with socialism. The USSR was a state capitalist dictatorship that exploited and oppressed its people. It was also an imperialist power in its own right, dominating Eastern Europe and subordinating it to Moscow's dictates in its competition with the US during the Cold War. By supporting the USSR, communists abandoned anti-imperialism and internationalism and replaced it with campism. It led them to ignore and deny the so-called socialist camps' exploitation of workers and oppression of nations and national minorities. Even worse, they supported those states in crushing the revolts by the masses against the dictatorships. Thus, the campus supported the crushing of the revolts in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1969, and the Tiananmen Square uprising in China in 1989. The campus extended this logic to other dictatorships in the developing world that had modeled their state-owned economies on the USSR and China. For example, they supported the brutal tyranny of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and the list could go on and on with many, many examples. Essentially, the campus adopted the bankrupt logic of my enemy's enemy is my friend. The campus played an outsized role, tragically, in the movement against Bush's war in Iraq. And in doing so, they helped generalize their worldview, even into sections of the broader left and even into the ranks of anti-war liberals. The campus tapped into legitimate contempt, especially in the United States, for US imperialism. Some sections of the US and British left that ought to have known better adapted to them to collaborate with them in anti-war formations. They did so by distorting the slogan, "the main enemy is at home," to mean that the US was the only enemy, that the anti-war movement should only oppose it and should not take any position on its rivals' imperialism or movements in those rivals' spheres of influence. The campus sections of the broader left and the liberal anti-war activists shared a profoundly mistaken view of the structure of imperialism today. They continued to view the world as a unipolar one, with the US dominating everything after the end of the Cold War. Of course, the US did possess such supremacy in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, and it did everything in its power to consolidate its global domination. But three key developments ended its unrivaled dominance. First, new and old rivals developed as a result of the gigantic neoliberal boom from the 1990s through the early 2000s. That enabled the rise of China, the rebuilding of Russia under Putin, and those powers became increasingly assertive in the world system. Second, Washington's catastrophic defeat in Iraq opened space for these rising rivals, to assert their interests in the world system, as well as regional ones like Iran and others in different regions and parts of the world. It also led its subordinate allies like Saudi Arabia to become increasingly assertive of their own interests separate from the United States. Third, the Great Recession further weakened the United States and its neoliberal model, opening space for China especially to present itself as an alternative. As a result, the US is no longer an unrivaled superpower. It remains the dominant nation in the world, but faces an imperial rival in China, a revitalized Russian imperialism, and a host of lesser regional powers. Moreover, the failures of the system are provoking waves of uprisings in all these states and spheres of influence. But the campus sections of the left and wide swaths of anti-war liberals misunderstood all these dynamics. They were therefore predisposed to betray the Syrian revolution and spread absolute slanderous lies about the revolution itself. They claimed Assad's regime was anti-imperialist, when that's simply not true. Assad had collaborated with Bush during the Iraq War in his program of extraordinary rendition, had curried favor with Hillary Clinton, who called him a reformer, kept peace on the Golan Heights to the delight of Israel, and happily collaborated with Russian imperialism. The campus claimed that the US was engaged in orchestrating a color revolution to carry out regime change. Again, completely false. Actually, after its defeat in Iraq, Washington had given up the policy of regime change for one of regime preservation against what they feared most, popular revolution from below. At first, they supported an orderly transition in Syria to preserve the regime minus Assad. But after the rise of ISIS, they abandoned that for a campaign solely focused on eradicating ISIS. As a result, they prevented the arming of the Free Syrian Army with anti-aircraft weapons called manpads it needed to challenge Assad's air force, and it tried to force sections of the armed resistance it trained to only fight ISIS. The campus claimed also that the revolution was comprised only of Islamic fundamentalists and terrorists, recycling the Islamophobic rhetoric of the war on terror that the regime had used against the revolution. Finally and absurdly, the campus actually supported Russian imperialism's intervention into Syria, as well as Iran's, as somehow anti-imperialist in a miraculous, illogical set of arguments. Tragically, many anti-war leftists and liberals tailed the campus, with the tragic result of supporting the war conducted by Assad, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah against the Syrian people. It is time for the international left to reject campism and rebuild the genuine tradition of anti-imperialism and international solidarity. The stakes could not be higher. Capitalism is in the midst of one of its greatest crises. There are uprisings that are sweeping all around the world, from the US with the Black-led multiracial rebellion to the renewed uprisings in the Middle East and to the uprising in Hong Kong and similar ones in Latin America. The new international left must be built by rejecting campism and adopting the genuine politics of anti-imperialism and international solidarity from below, with all legitimate and progressive revolts by the people for their own liberation.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you very much. I always wondered, like Jimmy Carter back in the day described Bashar al-Assad as strong and moderate leader. Madeleine Albright, and I was almost just to add on what Lara said, I remember very much when I was in Damascus, Madeleine Albright visited, and she said, talking about Bashar al-Assad, "It seems to me he is poised and someone who is ready to receive his duties. I was very encouraged by his desire to follow in his father's steps." So it's always fascinated me how someone described as such by the pinnacles of imperialism could become a star in the imagery of anti-imperialist politics. I'd like to invite Yassin El-Haj Saleh, our next speaker. Yassin El-Haj Saleh is a writer, former political prisoner from 1980 to 1996, author of 7 books on Syria covering topics such as prison and contemporary Islam and culture. I have my copy here as well. A founding member of Al-Jumhuriya.net and Hamish, the Syrian Cultural House in Istanbul, Turkey. He is the husband of the former political prisoner Samir al-Khalil, who was abducted along with 3 other activists, Razan Zaytouni, Wael Hamada, and Nazem Hamadi, in Douma, Damascus, in late 2013. I'd like to briefly quote something from Yassin's book. to Samira, the auspicious symbol of Syria, and to Syria, the symbol of a progressively Syrianized world. And perhaps this is why our webinar is ever more important. Yassine, I'm going to present my question to you. You moved to Damascus from Aleppo, Yassine, in 2000, after completing your higher education in the University of Aleppo. Of course, after a hiatus of almost 16 years due to your imprisonment by the regime of Hafiz al-Assad. You observed the inheritance of Bashar al-Assad, the coronation of Bashar al-Assad of the Syrian state and regime, and you observed all the changes, the nuances that came with that, the position of Syria in local, regional, and international politics, the changes in the social base of the regime. And historically speaking, after the handing down of colonialism, the mandates to local tyrants, few tyrants knew how to exploit this geopolitical strategic game more than Hafiz al-Assad. He played on both sides. He managed to get military and political aid from the Soviet Union while receiving the acknowledgement of and financial aid from the United States. Can you please, after your own political and social and personal trajectory, as well as your knowledge as an academic, present and elaborate on that? And thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Apart from the fact that I am not an academician, everything has been correct. Allow me first to, I have prepared something related to colonial governance relationships. I mean, the way colonial relationships, that colonial powers built with colonized native people are reproduced by local elites. But allow me first to comment on the coronation that you mentioned, Sarah. I think this was the biggest reactionary leap backward in the Syrian history. And what I find shocking, actually, what I find scandalous, is that I don't know that any democratic leader in the world or any leftist said that this shouldn't happen. The Syrian Arab Republic shouldn't suffer from this monarchical term, which reintroduced patriarchal and absolutism and which caused before 2000, the year 2000, the time of coronation or the time of inheritance, caused a big war in early 1980s with dozens of thousands of victims, and then 10 years after Bashar's rule, hundreds of thousands. So I come now to my intervention, colonial governance relationships. One can never exaggerate the devastating impact of Western imperialism in the Middle East. The region, from its name to its geopolitical makeup, is a creature of imperialist powers. And this is a structurally continuous condition reproduced by what Anibal Cujano, the Peruvian late academician, called coloniality of power. That's my theme is that, as I've just said, that colonialism was reproduced by local authorities. One can say that colonialism has never come to an end here in the Middle East, with Israel as a colonial and racist power enjoying an American guarantee of its qualitative superiority over all the Arab countries combined. By the way, this was mentioned and reiterated time and again up to 1980s. Then, apart from this fact that Israel superiority, the incorporating of the Gulf states in the American national security since the early days of the Cold War. And there has been one big war every decade in this region since 1948, since the Nakba of the Palestinian people. So the region remained tied in through these processes tied to imperialist centers. Then with the end of the Cold War, the introduction of war on terror rejuvenated the colonial nature of the Middle Eastern system. Middle East is not geographical region, it is a system. I'll say at once that it is a space of exception. But here I will focus on what can be called colonial governance relationships, the colonial ways of ruling societies, the way colonial powers did in the past. My point here is that the colonial relationships have been reproduced locally through three methods, fundamentally imperialist. I mean, these methods: state of exception, permanent state of exception, torture and torturous wars, and divide and rule as a method of governance. The outcome of these relationships for long decades is building an internal first world, what I call in the Syrian context, white Syrians who have privileged access to power, public resources, and the well-lit international stages, UN included, of course, UN and it is other organizations, and an internal third world, or black Syrians who can be tortured, killed, and raped in hundreds of thousands and whose lives don't matter. So if we define imperialism as structure of power and a relationship rather than an essence lurking in Washington or London or Paris and other Western capitals, the relationships between the internal first world and the third world, internal third world in Syria belongs to imperialist and colonial modes of governance. The country lived under a state of exception from the very first hour of the Ba'athist rule in March 1963. The first thing the Ba'athists declared is a state of emergency, which, I'm going to this. To be this state of exception was cancelled only after the Syrian revolution, in April 2011. Only to be replaced by a set of laws against terror. I mean, the same set of exception, but it was emergency law against the Israeli occupation, against the national enemy, which is Israel. Then it is justification or legitimation moved to change it to war on terror. What's common between these two periods is war. It is war. It is a permanent war. The war against the national enemy, then the war against terrorism. Why so? Why war is still going on? Because it is not only because it gives a free hand to the ruling elite in the lives and rights of the ruled and destroying the popular organization, but first of all because a permanent state of war is the ideal atmosphere for the primitive accumulation. What's a primitive accumulation? It is to put a gun to the head of somebody to take away one's property. This is what colonial powers did. According to Marx's capitalism, the primitive accumulation of capital was about piracy, about slavery, about colonialism, of course. And in Syria, it is this permanent war since 1963, which is 57 years. So the history of Syria in the Ba'athist and mostly the Assadist era is the history of emergence of a new ferocious class, very rich with a high fascist potential. In her analysis of imperialism, Hannah Arendt showed that there are laws in the imperialist centers, but only directives and decrees apply to the native peoples overseas. Lord Cromer in Egypt was one of her examples, actually was her main example. She saw this as something that differentiates modern imperialism from old empires. Old empires apply their laws on the lands, on the cultures that they rule, that they conquer. But I think there's another essential difference between old empires and the modern imperialism. Empires were seized by war and conquest. Imperialist colonial expansion up to our days is not a matter of war. We cannot talk about the British-Indian War in the 17th century. We cannot talk about Israeli-Gazan war or Israeli-Palestinian war. We cannot talk about the Assadist war against and Russian. This is not war. This is torture, actually. And in China, it was not war. It was torture. There was huge differences of force, of armies. So colonies are seized by genocides, torture, and guns on the heads. Both features, ruling by directives and decrees, and then torturous wars or torture, are introduced by the Assad rule. The violence, violence is exterminatory and torturous, and by no means war. It is not war. In my work, allow me just to say a few words about this. I differentiate between the three forms of violence: torture, war, and terror. Torture is the violence of the powerful against the weak. War between almost equal, a gang against a gang, a state against a state, an army against an army. And terror is the violence of the weak against the powerful. Terror is the violence of the weak against the. So the violence of the Assad rule is torturous. It is not war. When you use chemical weapons and barrel bombs and Scud missiles and jet fighters, this is not war. This is not war. This is torture. And we know, of course, that we have an industry of torture in the security dungeons. So under a permanent state of exception, Syria has been a torture state. Long years in jail and a paradise of impunity. We lived under permanent civil war, moving from cold to red hot one. In early 1980s, dozens of thousands, I've just said, and in 2011 up to now, hundreds of thousands of victims. Rightless Syrians have been politicized, killed for political reasons and killed politically. The way Palestinians are treated by the Zionist state. We have been Palestinized as the other, and this is the other phase of the process of the Israelization of the regime. And Israel is a colonial and imperialist power. The method of divide and rule, which is colonial device par excellence, is reintroduced and improved by the Assadis, who sell to the West, to the right-wing populism and to the right-wing movements in general, the discourse of protection of minorities, and it is consumed. Actually, it is a good commodity to sell there, and it is being widely bought there in the West. This is again a reproduction of colonialism by local elites. This reproduction of colonial relationships has completed full circle in the last few years when the white Syrians called ultra-nationalist powers of Iran and Russia to protect them. So we are going back to direct colonialism now. Russia has put its hands on the Syrian phosphate, on Tartus port for 49 years. This started 2 years ago, and now it is expanding the area of its military bases and facilities. Just 2 months ago, Putin bragged that 200 different sorts of Russian weapons proved very good in Syria, and that Russia had already contracts of $15 billion of arms sale, and contracts of 55 billions are to be signed soon. I think this is very imperialist hubris. We no longer hear this. We hardly hear this from the Americans now. Iran is buying real estates everywhere in the country, and I'm talking openly of controlling 4 Arab capitals. This is also, again, imperialist empire, imperialist hubris. Both the new colonial powers are manipulating the social fabric of the country and thinking of Syrians as solely belonging to sects, tribes, and regions, never as citizens who have right to rights. This is a formula by Hannah Arendt as well. This is the way the US, who seized Syrian oil, I mean, thinking of Syrians as belonging to sects and tribes and so on, the way US, who seized Syrian oil, is thinking of the local population of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is the northeastern part of Syria. It's called Al Jazeera, or the island in Arabic, because it is between the Euphrates and Tigris. So with its proxy, PYD, just parroting this same colonial method. When they want to say that we Arabs are represented, they bring people with ugol on these things, that local tribes. They are the modernists, they are the progressive, and these tribal Arab backward are still, they are. So it is colonial imagery. We know the role of colonial anthropology in the genocide of Rwanda. It is only short-sighted to say that Syria is different from Rwanda or Rwanda is different from Syria. Struggles among old and the new colonial powers are not to be excluded. Actually, Syria, we know that Syria is now a stage of tensions and levels of struggle, but they are within colonial paradigm or colonial rule relationships with no emancipatory potential about them at all. This colonial mode of power that relied on discrimination, torture, and massacres, and exceptions to reproduce itself opens up only to destruction. When 85% of the population are under poverty line, this is no longer poverty. And we can no longer talk about it in economic terms. This is national death. This is genocide by different means, or by means added to massacres and to torture and to bar bombs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yassine. With Yassine's intervention, we're coming to an end. And I would like to open for, do we have any questions and answers session? Do we have any questions from anybody? Okay. Okay. In case somebody we still have a lot of time for some questions and answers. In case somebody does have a question, please send it, and I'll make sure it reaches our speakers. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Yassine, also for your intervention. I think it's also very important to compare Syria and other genocides that went, such as Rwanda. I mean, we're in no way are we falling into any kind of Syrian exceptionalism here, which tends to be, which is sometimes a mistake that we might fall into, you know. I wanted to ask if I can ask if I can present a question. Why is this debate important? I mean, it's not that we are only answering, or we like Lara said, I loved it, the gaslighting of the imperialists left. Why is this debate important? Not only for the Syrian revolution, not only for the regional uprising that started back in 2011. Why is this debate relevant for building international movements, solidarities in a conjuncture, and I'm speaking here from Brazil, where a fascist regime is practicing genocide in the middle of a pandemic, which is killing already tortured populations, Black populations in the periphery of Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, in the Northeast, and all over the country. And I can give a lot of examples of a lot of other regimes all over the world. So please, I'm gonna go. I'd like to start with Lara, if you can answer my question.
Oh, can you come back to me? I have to sign out and sign back in.
Okay. Ashley, please.
Yeah, I think the stakes of the argument have both to do with Syria and many other liberation struggles throughout the world. So I think it's important to stick with Syria because it's been the place around which so much debate on the left has been engaged in internationally. And I think it's really a fight for the soul of the left on this question, because if we don't have a left that's capable of extending solidarity to mass popular uprisings like the Syrian revolution, we don't and won't have a left. We don't and we will not have a left for the future. So I do think the arguments around Syria are important in their own right, because the left should have sided with the Syrian revolution and could have made a material difference if it had done so, and especially if the anti-war movements of the world had done so in a principled fashion. Obviously, it could not have overcome the obstacles which could only be overcome in the end by the solidity of the revolt inside Syria itself, but we could have helped make a big difference. And so that's why the stakes is so important in Syria proper. But then I think secondly, it's also a precedent that if we don't correct on the Syrian case, it will affect other cases as well. And the most dramatic one, I think, is in Hong Kong over the last year, where we've had a massive uprising of, the majority of the population of the city of Hong Kong against China and against China's rule through its Quisling government in Hong Kong. And the left has been similarly split and fallen into exactly the same patterns that we saw unfold around Syria, with genuine anti-imperialists and genuine internationalists siding with the Hong Kong rebellion, but then whole other sections of the left doing exactly what they did to the Syrian revolution, to the Hong Kong uprising, demonizing it, discrediting it, saying it's a cat's paw of American imperialism, that it's a policy the US is pursuing through regime change, and siding with the Chinese state and its Quisling government and Hong Kong against the popular uprising. I think that's going to be played out throughout the world, and we have to fight for a left that's going to take the right position in all cases of anti-imperialism and solidarity with progressive revolts from below, no matter what sphere of influence they occur in.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Yassine, would you like to add anything to that?
I'd like actually to comment on Judith Naif. Can I move to? We have a question, Sarah. Do you see it?
Hi, yes, I'm going to just read out the question for everybody. Judith Naif is asking, commenting, thank you for this great panel. In many parts of the world, the party union-based left has all but disappeared. Often, young grassroots activists have taken over the struggle for social justice. My impression is that grassroots organizations generally sided with the Syrian revolution. My question for any speaker who would like to answer is, do you share this impression of a partly generational split in the global left and their position towards Syria? Yassine, please go ahead.
I don't know what Judith means. Maybe she means that the younger people are supportive to the Syrian uprising, to the Syrian struggle. Well, I'm not very young myself, so I want an exception for myself. I don't think actually it is a matter of a generational thing. Okay, most of the older generation, those who are still under the spell of the majority of the Cold War, yeah, tend to know by remembering instead of knowing. And one of my big shocks, actually, that it is the unprecedented, the extreme ignorance of our leftist comrades all over the world. And they have, I mean, they were well educated, they studied in good university, they speak many languages, they were not in jails, they were not censored, they can talk, they can know, they can find resources to knowledge. The extreme ignorance, actually, about Syria. Not a single, I'm sorry to say, I don't want to be very harsh, but I really have never found one interesting analysis, even in some big names, very big names. I mean, I don't want to criticize the guru Noam Chomsky, but he failed in 9 years and 3 months or 5 months now of the Syrian uprising to write one article, interesting article, one short article, interesting about Syria. So it is scandalous in a way. But for the younger generation, I'm not sure. I hope that they are less indoctrinated. I hope they are developing new approaches unrelated to the Cold War era. By the way, in the Cold War era, many people were more critical. I think that they developed this less critical attitude later, which applies to Chomsky, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Yassin Hashad. Actually, regarding Chomsky's position, I think this answers a bit Judith, but in another direction. Why people, when they get old, they get a bit more conservative. I was part of a meeting with Noam Chomsky with a lot of Syrian activists early in 2013. And we asked him, how come your position with regards to the Vietnam War was pro political violence and arming the revolution, whereas when it comes to Syria, it's not? I mean, we couldn't understand that. Is it just you become more of a liberal, or is it something that has to do with the fear of Islamists, the Islamist element, and well, eventually a racist position? Anyway, Lara, are you back with us?
Hello?
Hi, Lara. You're back with us, right?
Yes, I am.
Have you heard the question presented by Judith, one of our?
I have. Yes.
Please go ahead.
I can see this particularly among maybe young leftists, the younger generation who are just starting to get into politics. And I see this fragmentation within their solidarity. Mostly it's because, you know, we're online all of the time and we exchange information online, and you have this, I mean, monstrosity of a disinformation campaign which seeped into everywhere. And I mean, from the people I know around me, it was an emotional connection to them. When I tried to tell them, like, no, what happened in Syria wasn't about U.S. imperialism, they would think that I'm lying and so on. So that's why I think it's really important to arm ourselves against this pro-conspiracy and disinformation campaign.
Could I add a point in too, Sarah?
Please go,
is that all right?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just think back to the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011. I was in Madison, Wisconsin, and during the uprising, which was a workers' uprising against the shredding of union rights in Wisconsin, and I was stunned by the identification of the workers who were marching around the Capitol building of the state and had occupied the Capitol building of the state with hundreds and thousands of people the identification they all had with the Egyptian revolution. And I think that was generalized, widespread with all the revolts, that there was an impulse to identify with the revolts that was more than just generational. I think, though, that in particular around Syria, it became a debate because of Assad's regime being outside the U.S. sphere of influence, or Assad being really more accurately called a frenemy of the U.S., sometimes a friend, sometimes an antagonist of the United States. And given the left's weight on this position, the campus left's weight in this debate, they had an undue influence, and that stretched across generations. Even though I think Judith's right, there was an impulse toward solidarity, especially among younger activists. I do think that the ideological battle had a big impact on all generations, but it's not one that couldn't be overcome. So I participated with several other activists in Students for Justice in Palestine meetings and at their national convention. And when a good argument in favor of the Syrian revolution was presented, people gravitated toward it, because I think there's an impulse to solidarize with popular movements from below, but you have to be ideologically prepared to defeat the kind of campus arguments. That's why the stakes of this are so high, and it's all being played out around Hong Kong all over again.
Thank you very much, all three of you. If I may add just one thing, I think also this reflects much more, it's funny, this debate reflects much more on left-wing organizations and the crisis they are suffering all over the world. The problem of the Bolshevik Party, democratic centralism, is it this, is it that? It reflects more on this crisis than it does on the vicissitudes of the Syrian revolution. And we need to talk about that. We need to admit that. That these are much more a problem of, they're your problem, you as the left, anti-imperialist leftist bloc. And so I'd like to close with that. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Yassine. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to also let everybody know that we're having our next webinar the coming Sunday, July the 5th. Same time, but not same date. It's a Sunday, not a Saturday, at 2 p.m. EST. Feminist Politics and the Syrian Revolution. Participants, Razan Ghazawi, Maria Al-Abde, and Ziva Gorani, moderated by Frida Afari. Thank you very much. Shukran. Saudações revolucionários, like we say here in Brazil. And well, see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.